Hi everyone, and welcome to Chapter 2. In this chapter we cover an amazing breadth of subjects from the beginning of the Americas, the American colonies, through the philosophical progression that led to the ideas of revolution, the events, the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, ratification, a ton of subjects here to cover. I'm going to try to provide these videos for most of the chapters to add a little bit of meat to the bones of the text. Generally, I hate textbooks, but the text in here is pretty good, and I will just try to provide you with a little more information than there is in the text. Generally, the quizzes will be based primarily on the text. I want you to read the text and understand those things. But what I say in these short videos, I hope they'll be short. I'm going to try to keep them to 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes. What I'm going to try to do is give you information that hopefully is helpful, and this information will probably end up on the midterm and the final. If not directly in the forms of questions, indirectly in some of the forms of the questions. So I think these will be helpful to you. I hope you can learn from them. So one thing I want to do is just go through Chapter 2 and try to do this as quickly as I can. One thing I'd like to talk about, something that was in Chapter 1 that I'd like to get back to. When we talk about what happened towards the end of Chapter 1, they talk about the ideological spectrum. And I'm bringing up here, and hopefully you can see it, but on page 17 in the book, it gives you the spectrum. And towards the left, you go from moderate to liberal, socialist, and communist. And on the right, you go to conservative, reactionary, and fascist. Whereas conservative tends to be, and Edmund Burke, and we'll be reading Edmund Burke in this chapter, is kind of the father of conservatism. And he did some interesting writings and speeches that influenced generations to this day of people. And then if you go more than conservative, if you want to go back in time, conservative doesn't mean you want to go backwards. Conservative means you want to carefully move forward and progress. Reactionary would be you don't want to go forward, you actually want to go back. And towards the left side of the spectrum, you have liberal, which says you want to be more progressive and move forward. Socialist, which would say you would like more government involvement to protect yourself. And I think we talked about this, I hope, a little bit in Chapter 1 in the introduction to the course. The left side of the spectrum would be that of maybe Thomas Hill Green, where government needs to come in and protect rights to help you. The right side of the spectrum would be more of Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, saying actually the Thomas Jefferson idea is that the government that governs best is the government that governs least. There's something that a lot of books and a lot of people don't seem to understand, and you'll see on the far right you have fascist. Fascist doesn't align with the definition that we just gave of the spectrum. On the spectrum, to the right, you have less government. On the left, you have more government. Fascism is kind of maybe best described as a militaristic socialism. I think that's the best way to describe it. So I just wanted to say, in ideological terms, it's probably more proper to put fascist somewhere between socialist and communist. And again, the ideological spectrum, socialism and communism are kind of two different things, just when we're talking about philosophical politics here. Socialism is Marxism. Communism is the utopian idea of socialism. So again, I'm getting off topic, but let's move on to Chapter 2. Sorry about that. Okay, in Chapter 2 we already talked about Locke. I believe in Chapter 1 we talked about Locke, Hobbes, and Rousseau, the contractualist. And Locke's second treatise especially was powerfully influential to the thinkers of the American colonists at the time. More so than they were in Europe, where they tended to take more of the view, especially in France, of the Rousseau's idea of the social contract. And when we look later on in political parties and some of the other chapters in the book, we'll see that in America, they took on the Lockean view. In Europe, they took Rousseau's view, and that's still evident to this day. The book talks about the different settlements. I think we talked quickly about those. It's important to understand that the people who came over here had a definite perspective and idea of government. Again, we'll look at Edmund Burke's speech on reconciliation with the states, and he talks about one of the reasons why this fierce spirit of liberty is strong in the American colonists, the English colonies, was that they were all very well educated. And he talks about them selling nearly as many as Blackstone's commentaries on the law in the colonies as they had in England, which is very important to understand that the people that were colonists over here were generally well-read, educated people who studied the law. So when we talk about the different events that led to the Revolution, we have to talk about taxation. Taxation was important because the colonists had no representation in the legislature. This is what they talked about, an unwarrantable jurisdiction in the Declaration of Independence. And I think it's important to note that the 7-Year War had just ended. And England had won, but it had cost them terrifically. And not too many people talk about the 7-Year War. Generally, we call it the French Indian War because that's what happened over here. But it's important to note that the 7-Year War was really the First World War. There were battles over basically every continent where there were people in the world during the 7-Year War. And England had to pay for that. And they were going to try to pay for that by getting some money from the colonists. And they felt that that was fair because they had actually fought for the colonists in the colonies, and they felt that the colonists should pay their fair share. The colonists disagreed primarily because they did not have representation in the legislature. So, as part of their attempt to gain back some of the money they had lost in the 7-Year War, Britain begins to enact several laws to get money. And they had done several, but the ones that are important are in the book because they did things to the American colonies, like the Stamp Act of 1765. The reason the Stamp Act is important because it was this act which unified the colonies to come together and work as one. That was the important factor of the Stamp Act. Then there were the coercive acts, which became more stringent and influenced the colonies even more. And I'd just like to talk quickly about what happened during the Boston Tea Party. So Britain puts a tax on other teas besides British tea, so British tea would be able to be sold easier in the colonies, but the merchants there felt like this was making it harder for them to sell tea, so it just became a very sore point. So the Sons of Liberty get together in the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston and talk about concocting this idea for dumping the tea over the side into the harbor. What's interesting is you can still go to Boston today and go to this tavern and see where they sat, the Sons of Liberty, and plotted all of these different events. But certain men, like Samuel Adams, were there, and they were there early on advocating the acts such as these to control what they thought were the acts from the legislature and the acts from King George III, which were becoming tyrannical, they felt. So they come together in the First Continental Congress. And through this, they come up with some ideas. They're going to petition King George, and they do a couple of other things. They call for militias in all the different colonies. And they also call for, what were they? They were committees of safety or observation where people were to look around and see who was being loyal and who was, there were boycotts against many of the British goods because of taxation purposes, and this is something else that was bothering the Brits at the time. So as the Americans do things like they have the Tea Party in Boston, they very much anger Britain. And Britain is at a point where they're tired of the colonists and they see these acts as open rebellion. And I think what I'd just like to say is through these things you can see that as as this begins, it starts to snowball. You see Britain who's saying, look, we went and we fought the war, we saved the territory, we saved you, we need you to pay for that now. And you can see the colonies saying, okay, well, maybe we can pay for this, but we're English citizens and we have no representation in the legislature, so you really can't tax these things on us. And taxing was just one of the things. There were several other things. But this thing after the Certain Act starts to snowball. After the Tea Party in Boston, England actually blockades the Boston Harbor, which was extremely difficult to the people in Boston at the time. And the effect was, England thought they were being harsh and it was kind of like punishing a child, but the effect was to create solidarity between the colonies. You see this strong tie between the colonies, and especially two very powerful colonies that come out of this. Virginia and Massachusetts begin to work together to see what can happen, see if they should actually rebel. So the Second Continental Congress comes together and they draft this Declaration of Independence. And I've got to remember to put that file up there. It's a very short document. But when we talk about, when earlier in the first chapter in the introduction to the class, I talk about the philosophical development of political Western thought. And it basically began about 2,500 years ago. And we went through it really fast. What's amazing about the Declaration of Independence, it's a short document, but it's a philosophical justification for rebellion against tyranny. See, this was the first time in the history of the world that men had got together and decided to rebel on philosophical, ideological justification reasons. It wasn't going to be accident and force, which had usually happened, was usually the circumstance that changed regimes. They were going to do it with thought. And it was the first time that this had happened pretty much in the world. And it is amazing what Jefferson and the 5 other people that worked with him on this document were able to do in a couple of short pages to give a philosophical justification for rebellion. Something that philosophers to this day, Marx tried to do that. And I don't know if it's ever been done as well as they did in the Declaration of Independence. We could do a whole class simply on the beauty of that document. And not only the beauty of the document in terms of philosophical justification, but the fact that it was so pertinent to the time and what it had done in aspects of other countries in the world. You know, it wasn't long after the American Revolution that France wanted to do the same thing we did.